Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Novak, and I am one of the deputy directors of the Office on Trafficking in Persons National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. Thank you for joining our training on disaster management, preventing, and responding to human trafficking. This training was funded by the Administration for Children and Families Office on Trafficking in Persons through the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. All of our SOAR trainings are developed in collaboration with subject matter experts in the field, including those with lived experiences and partner organizations. This training is designed to equip disaster and emergency management professionals with the information and resources they need to prevent, identify, and respond to trafficking during disasters and emergencies. After you've finished this training, you'll be able to explain the intersection between human trafficking and a disaster, employ ways to educate and engage diverse partners, including healthcare teams, for support before, during, and after a disaster or an emergency, prepare educational and outreach materials about trafficking during a disaster, and helped connect individuals to resources and services that prevent and respond to trafficking. All of our SOAR trainings follow these 7 guiding principles that you see here, and you'll hear about them throughout this entire SOAR training to help you better understand disaster management. So the SOAR framework provides a quick mental reference for how to help individuals who may have experienced human trafficking. It's a trauma-informed approach that encourages professionals to be mindful of an individual's life experiences that may have caused trauma. So what is it that we mean by human trafficking? According to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, human trafficking is a severe form of trafficking in persons that's defined as using force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts or labor acts against their will. If someone is younger than the age of 18 and they are induced to perform commercial sex, force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be involved in order for the situation to be human trafficking. There are 2 types of severe forms of trafficking in persons. There's labor trafficking and there's sex trafficking. Labor trafficking is using force, fraud, and coercion to make individuals work or provide services. And sex trafficking is using force, fraud, or coercion to make individuals engage in commercial sex. And again, if that person is under the age of 18 years old, force, fraud, and coercion does not need to be involved in order for it to be a situation of human trafficking. So there's lots of different terminology that you might hear when you're speaking about someone who have experienced human trafficking. The most important thing to remember is that you should provide a safe space, a non-judgmental space for that individual to self-identify however they choose. Remember that choosing to identify as a survivor is a choice, and there is a big difference in acknowledging someone's experiences in order to access different services and support versus acknowledging any of their experiences in a professional setting. So some people might choose to disclose their experiences inside a professional setting, and some may not. It's really important to also avoid language that might have any kind of negative connotation, and that might bring up any kind of stigma. So you want to be using person-first language. So person-first language describes a person as having a condition or being in a circumstance. So for example, if you use the phrase high-risk population, it's very different from the term people at an increased risk of trafficking, because the first example, at-risk population, assigns a label to an entire population, whereas the second example describes a condition that might exist for people within a population. So person-first language refers to the individual first, and then the condition that they may experience second. And it's always best to ask an individual for their preference and how they would like to be identified. Go with however it is that they choose to be identified. So let's go ahead and dig into the module on disaster management. So we will dig into lots of different strategies for prevention and response. In this section, we'll talk through training, we'll talk through community engagement, we'll talk through different communication strategies, how to address basic needs, how to collaborate with nonprofits, and then also what are some different survivor-informed approaches for both reaching an individual's basic needs, and then making sure that the services that they're being provided are trauma-informed, effective, and respectful. So the whole training is framed around the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And this framework was created by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in 2016. And it establishes a common platform for how communities can build, sustain, and coordinate their recovery capabilities. So this really looks at prioritizing preparation for recovery before a disaster even happens. And it's looking at prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. We utilize this framework to look at the training through Ready, Respond, and Recover. And this framework was created through discussions with the Office on Trafficking in Persons and the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, both of which are under the Department of Health and Human Services. There was a convening, a few day convening that brought together those two agencies, as well as different experts in the field of human trafficking and disaster management, to discuss how professionals can prevent human trafficking during and after disasters. And so this is the way that we'll be framing the entire training for today. So we'll start with Ready. When you're thinking about Ready, you're really thinking about how to ensure to equip a community to seamlessly serve individuals that may experience trafficking before a disaster occurs. So that means thinking about who you should be providing training for, understanding the community that you live in, and which populations historically are placed at a higher risk for human trafficking. Building relationships with community leaders within that community. They may be able to help craft some of that message that would better be able to reach the constituents within the community, and distribute some of those different materials for raising awareness ahead of time, including information about human trafficking within existing protocols, as well as developing local and national referral process, is also incredibly important. And this is what we'll be looking at within the Ready context. So when you're thinking about the connection between human trafficking and disasters, you want to think about the fact that disasters and emergencies regularly disrupt and damage different human services and social services infrastructures, different systems, and different networks that communities rely on to survive. And this can also lead to migration or evacuation because of this disrupted and damaged infrastructure and systems. So many disasters and emergencies require a response from emergency managers and first responders before an emergency occurs. That's that preparation. And when thinking about areas that where you might see some kind of emergencies or disasters, they come in the form of hurricanes, of wildfires, of pandemics, which we all experienced recently. You can think about it in terms of oil spills or winter freezes. So efforts to prevent trafficking in disaster areas require both governments, private businesses, social services, to all collaborate to implement different laws and guidelines and policies in order to effectively respond to a potential crisis that happens. And the settings that you see here are areas and opportunities that are great for raising awareness about the connection between human trafficking and disasters, all as part of your prevention efforts. So when you're in these settings, you may be able to reach various constituents while collaborating with different community partners. So you might want to be distributing education materials. You might want to be discussing different indicators of trafficking with volunteers. You might want to be making reports of potential trafficking that's occurring, depending on what your role is as a disaster manager. And these sites vary depending on the type of disaster or emergency that is occurring or that you're responding to. And so we'll talk more about what roles look like in terms of different communication approaches later within this training. But the first key aspect of being ready to respond to an emergency is training. And so think about it as a tiered approach to training. So you want to think about the first responders, federal partners, volunteers, community-based organizations for training. And it's those first responders that receive that immediate training on how to identify all types of human trafficking and how to respond. So the more aware that they are, and the more training that they have, the more likely it will be that they'll be able to identify and support individuals that might be experiencing trafficking during disasters. And then when you think of the next tier, is you think of long-term training for folks like case managers, long-term service providers. They all need a different set of skills. And so you are thinking about what human trafficking looks like in their local context, how to make sure you're thinking about different cultural dynamics when identifying and responding to trafficking, and also what kind of trafficking schemes are in that area. You want to make sure that that training is really localized to your constituents and the particular area that you're serving. So throughout the training, we're going to go through a case study and think about yourself as a regional communications manager for Red Cross in some kind of Gulf Coast city. So thinking about cities where you're seeing a lot of hurricanes, and there's a lot of different weather events. So after you, as a communications manager, learn about that connection between human trafficking disasters, you decide to talk to your supervisor about how you should prevent, identify, and respond to trafficking if a disaster does come about within your community. And so together, you and your manager decide to implement a training for other Red Cross staff on how to identify and respond to trafficking. So step one, you think through what that training should look like. So we'll come back to the case study throughout this training on other steps that you can take as a communications manager for the American Red Cross. So thinking about potential indicators of human trafficking, there are various indicators that may be signs of sex or labor trafficking occurring. But please note that not every individual will present the same, will show the same indicators. We really want to be thinking about what those upstream determinants of trafficking are and how that may arise as potential indicators in your workplace. So the field really is thinking about shifting away to thinking about what some of those are, to trying to think about a more holistic approach to identifying someone that might be experiencing trafficking. And so we really want to be thinking about the fact that folks have lots of diverse experiences, and trafficking does not fit a one size fits all profile, really. So there are people from various backgrounds and circumstances that experience any kind of victimization. And so it's really crucial to avoid making any kind of assumptions based on appearances as alone, for example. You also really want to be thinking about the subjectivity of those indicators. So indicators can be really subjective and depend on the context. So what might seem suspicious in one situation might not always seem suspicious in another. So it's really essential to consider the broader context and individual circumstances when you are seeing some of these indicators pop up, and you are thinking about whether or not it might be a situation of human trafficking. The other thing to really remember before we dig into some of these indicators is that just because you do notice one of these indicators does not mean an individual might be experiencing trafficking or might be experiencing any kind of exploitation. These are just some of the potential signs or signals that it might be happening. So really quickly, we can run through some of those physical indicators. You might see untreated workplace injuries. You might see some kind of exposure to toxic chemicals or some kind of respiratory issues. There could be multiple pregnancies or pregnancy terminations. You could see an increase in substance use. So those are some of those potential physical indicators. In terms of different behavioral indicators, you might see someone who is protecting the person that you believe is actually trying to harm them and then is minimizing that type of abuse that you are witnessing. There might be some sexual acting out, especially in children or young adolescents. And I know this is difficult because you're thinking about disaster situations, but you might start to identify some kind of depression or anxiety or psychological trauma that might be there. There might be some fear that appointments, if you're in the medical field or the behavioral health field or social services field, or as you're sitting and doing work as a disaster responder, there might be some kind of fear of appointments that are taking a little bit longer than they should be and needing to get back to wherever situation they were coming from previously. And then lastly, in terms of environmental potential indicators, you might see someone who is being constantly accompanied by a person who won't leave them alone, is following them around regularly and is speaking on their behalf. You might see that someone is living at work or living in really overcrowded working conditions with other folks that they work with. You might hear that someone was recruited for different work than what they are currently doing. So they thought that they were going to be working, say, in a restaurant, and they end up working in construction, for example. And again, right, there are these various indicators, but this list is not exhaustive, and it does not necessarily mean that someone might be experiencing trafficking. So this is a different case study. It's not the one that we are walking through. This is one that is a real life case study. So in 2015, there was a really famous case called the Signal International Workers case. And this set a post-disaster legal precedent, stating that we need to work to mitigate the risks associated with the rebuilding efforts after a national disaster. So Signal International is a US Gulf Coast shipbuilding company. And after Hurricane Katrina, they recruited workers from India to help with the rebuilding efforts in New Orleans. The workers got to the US and they were forced to live in fenced-in labor camps with sometimes, 24 different men in one housing unit. They were working around the clock with little to no pay. There was lots of instances of exploitation that was happening. And these recruiters that identified folks in India to bring to the United States charged those workers $10,000 to $25,000 in recruitment fees, which is illegal. And the workers entered the United States lawfully through an H-2 visa program, which is a work program. So it's important to remember that these workers did come into the United States lawfully. They were told that they were going to have excellent jobs. They were told they would get green cards, and they were told that they were going to get employer provided housing. And what happened was they were put in really poor housing conditions. They were never given any kind of green cards. They were forced to work around the clock. They also threatened folks who said that they were going to speak out against the working conditions that they were facing. So the case went through the legal system, and the jury awarded $14 million in damages to the Indian workers that were exploited by Signal. And they used that, they did that through utilizing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This case is really important because labor traffickers are rarely ever prosecuted. And this case it is a reminder that there are not only risks for workers involved in rebuilding efforts, but also for companies left with the task of rebuilding. So, um, during recovery, it's important to keep in mind who is made the most vulnerable by mandatory closures and rebuilding efforts in the aftermath of disasters or emergencies, which types of professionals in which types of professions. So, the industries that you'll see that are in high demand or whose activities have been most disrupted are the ones that are at increased vulnerabilities for potential exploitation. So it's these that are listed here: construction, plumbing, teachers, hotel workers. So loss of employment may be exploited when you're thinking about, teachers and hotel workers that lose their job because of uh, any kind of forced shutdowns, right? Or for folks forced to leave different areas. So during emergencies, hotel workers are impacted as travel comes to a standstill. Restaurant workers can also lose their jobs as a result of mandatory closures and different declines in travel. So in 2005, we saw this impact after Hurricane Katrina on these industries. And uh, and this is what you see as a result is the Signal International case that we just walked through. So it is important to note that while primary vulnerabilities are labor related, there also may be a market for potential sex trafficking and sexual exploitation as well. So when you're thinking about the risks to workers in the aftermath, you want to really be thinking about the operational challenges that exist and how that then leads to different worker vulnerabilities. And so this is an example that shows that walks through this. So let's say a contractor moves into a recovery area, right? So say they move into New Orleans after a disaster. And that company is really moving there to take advantage of increased short and long-term recovery efforts. There's a lot of money that can be made there. So the contractor might underbid their proposal in order to win a contract that's worth a lot of money. And because a lot of folks have to leave the areas regularly, sometimes the labor force might be scarce in that area. So as is the case in Katrina. And so people will be brought in from other areas or from other countries, and they'll be brought on different visas, so H-2A or H-2B that happened with the Signal case, to fill different labor shortages that are currently occurring in the area. And so the contractor might take advantage of also different limited legal protections and monitoring that happens when disasters sometimes occur. And we'll talk about what that looks like in the future with laws that are lightened during disasters in order to speed up recovery efforts. So these type of operational challenges then can lead to worker vulnerabilities in many ways. And so there could be a rapid response that leads to lesser due diligence in terms of the contractors and the verification of different worker sites. Contractors might try to maximize profits by producing the cheapest possible labor, and sometimes that means illegally and through exploitation. Um, Different fraudulent contractors might recruit foreign workers with false promises of good pay, good wages, different good jobs. And then you might see foreign born internationals legally in the United States that are already here. That may be sent to different recovery sites by their employer to maximize efforts. And they often have limited grievance mechanisms and restricted access to healthcare and medical insurance, despite some of these dangerous work sites. So, as we talked about, disruptions in local services to housing, to economic stability, and social connections, it really increases vulnerability to exploitation during disasters. And so, we need to be thinking about what some of the basic needs are, and then what some of those rebuilding efforts and closures are to really dig into to make sure that you're mitigating any types of potential exploitation that may occur. So when you think about basic needs during a disaster, they can include food, they can include baby supplies, shelter, and even employment. And all of these are exacerbated by a disaster or emergency as different homes and hospitals and schools and other types of infrastructure are destroyed. So then businesses close and different networks are disrupted. So individuals with existing vulnerabilities might be offered basic needs or way to make money fast. And then they might be asked to repay those needs through performing some kind of commercial sex act. And historically marginalized people may be recruited online or in shelter settings. So, for example, you might hear if you're working in a shelter setting, someone say, my friend has a place that you can stay, or I know a way that you can make quick cash. And that might then lead to a way to exploit that individual. When you're thinking about how folks can be exploited in different rebuilding efforts, those so recovery efforts often include massive rebuilding due to sustained property damage, which, as we talked about, can lead to large scale migration of laborers coming in to meet the demand of that rebuilding. And that increase in demand might also involve the recruitment of foreign labor or pulling folks in from outside of the community, and which then just brings the opportunity for contractors to exploit workers with promises of resources and employment. And in this type of scenario, undocumented workers are at a particularly increased risk of trafficking as they're more likely or they more frequently work in dangerous settings like construction, and traffickers can exploit their fears of deportation. So when you're thinking about how to mitigate that, you want to be aware of false job ads on social media that might be targeting certain demographics. Um, in addition, emergencies often lead to lifting important federal regulations that leave workers more at risk of exploitation. So, for example, during Hurricane Katrina, the Davis-Bacon Act, which ensures local prevailing wage is paid, was eased with little or no increased monitoring, again, to try to speed up the rate of recovery. And then when you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, there were lots of mandatory closures across the entire world that led to higher rates of unemployment and put millions of people at risk for labor exploitation as they struggled to make ends meet. So now we're going to focus on how to appropriately respond in the case of an emergency or disaster. So we're on back to the National Discovery or Disaster Recovery Framework. We're looking at respond. And so when we're thinking about response, we're going to be thinking about how to implement a communication strategy to educate audiences on trafficking and different disaster vulnerabilities, how to disseminate information on tactics that traffickers may use before, during, and after a disaster or emergency, how to identify the extent of an impact of disaster or emergency and chart the path to a realistic recovery, how to conduct intake and screening for individuals who may be experiencing trafficking, and how to identify children and adults who might be experiencing human trafficking, and then who to reach out to in those instances. So what we're going to be doing is looking at the timeline for response, looking at this recovery continuum. And for this part, we're really going to be focusing in on this red area, that short-term part of the continuum. So this really illustrates the readiness, response, and recovery process. Um, so when you're thinking about what we mean when we're thinking about some of the short-term response, you're thinking about uh, providing emergency medical treatment, providing shelter, providing services, etc. There are lots of different opportunities for disaster management professionals to respond in thinking about prevention and response. And so when you're thinking about that immediate response in the aftermath of a disaster, it could include thinking about leveraging all different types of communication that is available. It can include working to address those basic needs efficiently and equitably as possible. And that way you're reducing the potential for exploitation or trafficking. It's distributing education and awareness and outreach materials to different pre-identified touch points. It's training employees and volunteers to educate individuals that they're working with that might experience trafficking, as well as educate businesses on policies that are needed during a response in order to make sure that supply chains are trafficking and exploitation free. And it's also identifying suspected cases of trafficking and offering resources and referrals. So ideally, all of these opportunities will be standardized already or woven into disaster and emergency communications and response around some kind of disaster event. So as we discussed, disasters often result in an increased demand for labor when it comes time to rebuild or to recover. And so it is really important to be aware of different policies on disaster response, procurement, and labor protection, and incorporate trainings about each of these for employers and employees. So when you're thinking about what needs to be trained on, think about training on the National Defense Authorization Act, which prohibits trafficking in government contracting. Additionally, the Department of Defense, the General Services Administration, and NASA issued a final rule amending the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FARC, to strengthen protections against trafficking in persons in federal contracts. And these changes support the implementation of Executive Order 13627, entitled Strengthening Protections Against Trafficking in Persons in Federal Contracts. So there are lots of different opportunities to communicate preventative awareness strategies through emergency communication systems. So when you're thinking about who should be communicating, first and foremost, you need to communicate with members of the incident response team and first responders. And then those folks then are responsible to communicating that information out to constituents, to site staff or volunteers, and then to shelter or quarantine residents. Also to different vaccination sites, to different medical sites, etc. And then how they should be communicated really depends on your area. There are lots of different ways that you can dig into that though. So you want to first think about different emergency alert systems that allow for text messages. This is a way to reach a lot of your constituents very quickly. You can think about different press conferences or local news coverage. You might even be able to leverage multiple news conferences held by mayors or county officials or first responders that folks tend to be watching 24/7. And that way you can reach a good amount of folks as well and heighten that awareness. Newsletters or handouts or notes are really important. These are more individualized ways to get the word out in different assistance centers. So vaccination sites, quarantine centers, shelter settings, excuse me. And this is really great, especially for folks that might not have access to technology, to phones for whatever reason. And then finally, government officials like mayors and county officials often have some large followings on social media, and that can be a really great place to raise awareness about both the connection between trafficking and disasters, and then what to do if you are being exploited or you believe someone might be exploited. So remember that leveraging every single opportunity that you have to get the message out in mass, and to anyone that might be involved in operations is key to getting it out to your constituents. So when you're thinking about emergency texts or press conferences or newsletters or flyers or screens or social media, however it is that you're getting the message out, there are lots of things to think about to be as effective as possible. So first and foremost, partner with other nonprofits in the area, partner with local government as well, so that you can immediately launch a social media campaign and counter any kind of false job promises that might be exploitative, as well as increase any kind of awareness about common post-disaster trafficking schemes and recruitment tactics. Get that information out as quickly as possible for folks. Post messages before, during, and after the disaster. Pre-schedule them if you can. Ensure constituents know that if they find themselves in a dangerous situation, that they know that there are numbers out there that they can call for help. What are those numbers? You can think about utilizing the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which we'll talk through later on in the training, or any kind of local numbers as well. It is very important, again, to know the demographics in your community, to know your constituents, and to provide messaging in the most common languages in the community to be sure that all community members have equal access to that messaging and the information. And in fact, populations that do not speak English may have increased vulnerabilities to human trafficking, especially in disaster situations. So you might want to consider creating increased communications for those populations in those languages. Some communities have a significant amount of cultural or community or historical trauma, especially around natural disasters, and therefore might have less trust in first responders. And so there might be concerns for things like deportation. And so in that situation, it's really important to partner with leaders and organizations that are community-based, that the community actually trusts. Have them disseminate the information. That can be really helpful, because that message will be heard better from the organizations and the leaders that they actually trust. The other quick thing to remember is that social media platforms have limited limitations to the number of characters they are able to use. So really thinking about how to get the message as short as possible, and as effective as possible. The Office on Trafficking in Persons has a public awareness campaign called Look Beneath the Surface, and they have resource that helps folks understand what their rights are during a disaster that you're welcome to share. And so those are on the Office on Trafficking in Persons websites where you can access those. They're also on the National Human Trafficking Hotlines website resources. That one in particular is called Understanding Your Rights During Disaster and Recovery. So when you're thinking about being culturally and linguistically responsive during disasters, in general, being culturally and linguistically responsive is about the capacity for individuals and organizations to communicate with individuals effectively in cross-cultural situations. And so you're thinking about how to adapt and implement strategies to ensure that the appropriate level of communication is being used, that there's an appropriate level of awareness, and that attitudes and actions using policies and structures or practices and procedures are dedicated to that particular resource that support that level of understanding through the communication. So when you're working to provide response to disasters, it's really important to adapt and implement strategies in your individual and organizational work to support the needs of diverse populations in general, but especially the needs of your constituents. So when you're thinking about a cultural responsiveness and how to be culturally responsive in that setting, you're thinking about it's a developmental process where individuals or institutions achieve high levels of awareness. So being culturally responsive includes valuing diversity, avoiding different stereotypes, managing the dynamics of differences, understanding cultural knowledge, and adapting to diversity and cultural contexts within your community. So really understanding who your community is and what they value, and making sure that that is all folded into your communication. Having linguistic responsiveness is the ability to convey information in a manner that's easily understood by diverse audiences. And that includes people with limited English proficiency. It includes those with low literacy skills or who may not be literate at all. And it also includes those with disabilities. So linguistic responsive organizations, they can provide individuals with readily available and appropriate oral and written language information through having interpreters, through having bilingual staff, to having medical interpreters for folks that don't understand some of the medical language as well, and as well as qualified translators. So what you see here is an example of that individualized communication. This is an example of a cot to cot communication that you could put in areas like quarantine zones and shelters to really connect with the folks that are staying there. So these are some different examples of questions that you might have on those communication cards to get folks thinking about what they are actually currently experiencing, and if that might mean that they might be exploited and they might need some help. So you want to make sure that you're including warnings about false job ads that might be linked to housing offers, and provide phone numbers for a person or an organization that they can call if need be. Remember to have volunteers and staff assigned to various distribution centers and distribution points. And you could actually consider going room to room or cot to cot with these note cards to raise awareness. You want to think about especially having it in areas where a large number of folks congregate. And then where is it that you should communicate? So in the disaster management field, we refer to areas that are opportunities for outreach as touch points. And so if a quarantine or a shelter has been stood up, there are several different messaging distribution touch points. And that might include intake or entry. It includes bathrooms. It includes FEMA registration desks. It includes different food distribution centers or child play areas, different medical care areas, volunteer staff criterias. These are just some of the possible areas for educating community members about common post-disaster trafficking schemes and recruitment tactics. And it's also a really excellent place to offer resources for people who are at risk of being trafficked or who have been trafficked. So just keep in mind that depending on your audience, that communication is going to look a little different. We know that disaster management professionals play an important role in identifying and identifying communication channels and touch points to leverage before, during, and after a disaster, and then also coordinating with responders, or coordinating with partners to execute a response. Um, and so when you take a look at these different partners and what some of their roles include, we can look at with disaster management professionals. They are the ones that are assessing the impact of the disaster and coordinating all of the different partners, getting them ready to implement whatever it is that they are actually in charge of. Nonprofit partners that are operational, they might have case managers that are on call to receive referrals, to conduct intakes, to assist with safety planning. They will probably be able to amplify any kind of social media messaging and might even be able to help design that campaign, as oftentimes they are the folks that are trusted within communities. Volunteers might be able to do that cot to cot outreach and handing out different awareness and communication materials at all of the different touch points. Some shelters, they may be able to provide that temporary shelter or interim care for folks, especially interim care for unaccompanied minors. They might be able to connect to other different resources, and they can also serve as a touch point for communication. So each of the partners that we just discussed plays a really crucial role in identifying and reporting potential cases of trafficking. So more specifically, during an intake, the primary goal is to assess an individual's immediate needs and then refer them to the appropriate services and resources that they need that are going to help them in the immediate. Um, and so first and foremost, it's not trying to identify if that person might be experiencing trafficking or some kind of exploitation. It is meeting their immediate needs. What do they need in that moment? And then after you've met that individual's immediate needs, then you can consider providing either universal education about what trafficking looks like, or utilizing a screening tool to really figure out if someone might need support in terms of um, being in a trafficking situation. So the purpose of universal education is to provide all individuals that you see with information about human trafficking, information about their rights, information about how their health might be impacted because of the situation that they're in. And this can really start to open up a conversation about trafficking, where folks might then start to tell you some of the experiences some things that they're experiencing that they would not have opened up to otherwise. Um, and then when you are providing universal education or screening for individuals, it's really important that staff and volunteers are using the same questions or the same tool for screenings identified by your organization before the emergency or the disaster. It can be built, universal education and screening can be built into your the intake process that you already use. It can be conducted at all of the different touch points that we've already discussed. For example, shelter registration forms can be designed to include screening potentially. Um, the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center has about 12 now different SOAR online modules. One of the modules is about universal education and screening. So if you're interested in when to use universal education versus screening and how to use it, please do go to the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance website to watch some of those other trainings. When you are reporting a suspected case of trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is really the best resource that you could use that should be included in your organizational protocol. Um, The information for the hotline is included at the end of this training so that you can write that down. It is also, though, important to make sure that you have connection to local organizations that are providing services and resources, and that might be able to connect you with law enforcement if need be. So, for adults who might be experiencing trafficking, it is incredibly important to remember that they have agency as to whether or not they would like to work with law enforcement. And so you want to make sure that you're talking to them that first and foremost, and then offering the National Human Trafficking Hotline number and potentially another local reporting option. Missing or unaccompanied children should be identified and reported to the unaccompanied minor registry. Um, you also want to make sure that you are providing all of the resources that are that individual is interested in accessing. And so knowing the resources, the local resources on the ground are really important. It's also really important to be aware of your local mandated reporting obligations for trafficking of both minors as well as adults. All right, so let's go back to our case study in the Gulf Coast city. So remember, you are a Red Cross worker, you're a communications manager. And so the city in which you're working is hit by a huge Category 4 hurricane. And overnight, 14,000 people become in need of temporary shelter because of the devastation from flooding. The Red Cross quickly steps in and opens 8 different shelters across the city at the convention center, at schools, and at other different centralized locations. And then over the next few days, as the water recedes, some of the people that had originally accessed shelter are able to leave to go to family or different friends. However, there are still some folks from structurally marginalized groups, such as Black communities and immigrant communities, that continue to require shelter and connections to other emergency services. Um, and a lot of the organizations and businesses remain closed, which means that there is this increased risk of potential exploitation. So we'll come back to that towards the end, excuse me, towards the end of the training. So finally, we'll dig into the recovery aspect of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And so when you're considering the connection between trafficking and disasters on the recovery side, you want to be thinking about adding human trafficking standards to your national incident management system. You want to think about following up with individuals who made connections to services in the aftermath of disasters to ensure that they are doing okay. Make sure that access to post-disaster behavioral health services are available. Make sure that you're using the unaccompanied minor registry for any kind of reunification efforts of families. Um, really know and understand and abide by policies on disaster response procurement and labor protection from some of those laws and policies that we mentioned earlier. Make sure that you're incorporating information on trafficking into ongoing training for employers and employees. So when you're thinking about this timeline for response within the recovery continuum, we're going to be focusing on the more intermediate and long-term periods. So this is the weeks or months or even years following disaster or emergency. Efforts may focus on rebuilding housing, rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding businesses, providing ongoing emotional and psychological support to individuals that experienced this exact disaster and may have experienced human trafficking in the wake of it. So it's really important to establish relationships with partners before the incident occurs, just as it's important to make sure that trafficking is is woven into your policies and procedures, and employers have received training before the disasters occurs. So when you're developing these relationships, there are some considerations to take. Make sure that you're prioritizing partners that can support language access for individuals with limited English proficiency. Make sure that you are including any of the local anti-trafficking organizations and their volunteers for support. Um, some of the other partnerships that you want to make sure you have are with homeless or domestic violence shelters, as well as different hotels that might be able to support when you need to get someone out of a trafficking situation during an emergency and there's already a strain on any kind of shelters. Make sure that you have a list of local partners that can support complex needs of individuals that might have experienced trafficking during a disaster. So you want to think about having public health assistance, so TANF or food assistance. Make sure that you have connections to different healthcare, mental health, or substance use treatment organizations. And remember that community partners need to also have their own disaster response plan in place. So they are tapped into the local response plan and also have their own so that they can continue um, providing the services that they do when things are shut down across communities due to emergencies. Your organization will be much better equipped to serve individuals who are at increased risk of trafficking or who might be experiencing trafficking if you have already built a comprehensive protocol before disaster takes place again. So when you're thinking about what should be included in a protocol, remember that crafting messaging that includes potential indicators that we discussed is a really important. You might want to consider working with a partner such as a community-based organization or a nonprofit organization to help develop and produce these materials. You want to make sure that any of those materials are printed ahead of time so that they are ready to disseminate both before and after the disaster. And those nonprofit partners are also really great folks that can help you with the dissemination efforts too. Um, Make sure that you're building information about trafficking into your existing organizational protocol, and train your staff on those protocols. So what should be included in those protocols when it comes to trafficking is information on how to identify and respond to someone who is at an increased risk of trafficking or who may be experiencing trafficking during disasters. It's also incredibly important, as we just discussed when we were thinking about the different partnerships, that you have a local and national referral process included in your protocol. This is really critical when it comes to readiness, because what happens if you identify someone that might be experiencing trafficking, but you do not know who to reach out to and how to get that individual support? So you as disaster manager professionals should already know how to connect to both local and national referrals if you suspect someone might be experiencing trafficking. And so again, this really, really includes the National Human Trafficking Hotline that has an understanding of different organizations that are able to serve people who might be experiencing trafficking across the entire country. So when you're thinking about how to work with partners in the recovery phase, let's dig into what each of these partners can do. So as a disaster management professional, you can ensure that human trafficking standards are added into the National Incident Management System. You can build trafficking assessments into your protocols already. And then you can also provide ongoing training to your partners and to your staff. Nonprofits can continue to serve as connections to ongoing services, again, to to case management, to housing services, to medical and behavioral health services, to any kind of emotional or psychological support that people may need after a disaster. Volunteers can support nonprofits in their efforts to continue to provide long-term services and follow up. And then similarly, shelters may be able to provide ongoing services for those who continue to be impacted as well. So with the partners that we just discussed, you can really work together to meet the emergency or the immediate, the medium term, and the long term needs of individuals who experience trafficking in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. Um, and these are just some of the different types of services that people might need in the emergency, medium, and long-term parts of a disaster. NITAC has a tool that we created called Remote Service Delivery During Disasters. That's a really wonderful tool, again, that is on our website that you can download in the resources section. And we created that on behalf of the Office on Trafficking and Persons. It's really meant to be a quick reference fact sheet for frontline professionals or providers to prepare for emergencies and then how to actually respond. So those, again, they're all on the NITAC website. So let's go back to our case study again. So again, remember, you are the communication professional. Um, and you work for the Red Cross, and the area in which you work was just hit by a Category 4 hurricane. So, together as the communication manager, together with your partners, the Red Cross has been working to meet the immediate and short-term needs of individuals, as well as families who have been affected by the destruction of the weather event. Because of the damage, there is about $190 billion that is needed to fix that structural damage along the coast. And so that's going to require some massive recovery and rebuilding efforts. And from your training that you took, you know that these ongoing efforts could leave a number of people at risk of exploitation or even trafficking. And as well as the communications manager, you went ahead and you implemented a strategy in the days immediately following the disaster to educate audiences on the intersection of trafficking and disasters, especially in the wake of a disaster. And so that means that you are really thinking through the weeks and the months ahead and how you can continue to support counter trafficking efforts within your community. So that's the end of the training. Hopefully, after taking this training, you can now explain the connection between trafficking and a disaster, employ ways to educate and engage diverse partners, including healthcare teams for support during, before, during, and after a disaster or an emergency. You can prepare educational and outreach materials about trafficking during a disaster, and you can help to connect individuals to resources and services to prevent trafficking. This is the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center's contact information. Um, this is the website that I mentioned earlier, where you can get access to any of the different resources or materials that we discussed, particularly about emergency and disaster recovery response. So please do feel free to go online and access those services. You can go ahead and give us a call. We are available between 8:30 a.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. You can also feel free to email us if you have any questions. And finally, as I promised, this is the National Human Trafficking Hotline number that's on your screen. In order to reach out to the hotline, you can either go ahead and give them a call. You can also chat with a live advocate through the link that's included on this slide, or you can text an advocate at 233-733, which spells out Be Free. The Human Trafficking Hotline is a comprehensive service referral network for anybody that might be experiencing trafficking. So folks that are experiencing trafficking are able to call to try to access services or get help with reporting. Or folks that might know someone that's experiencing trafficking, either personally or professionally, are also able to do that as well. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year. Thank you so much for joining. If you're interested in any of our other SOAR online trainings, please feel free to go to our website to take a look at all of our other offerings. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day.